Hi guys, I am painting my graffiti color wheel today. Earlier today I already did a coat of yellow, orange, and red in each section where they appear. In one section the yellow will appear as a background, and in its opposite complementary section it'll appear as your actual graffiti. So the letters or your shapes that are in the foreground. That works for every single one. So over here I have red as the graffiti letters and the foreground, and over here I have it as the background. For this one I have orange as the background, and over here I have it as the foreground. Before I paint any of my colors, especially the light colors like yellow, yellow-orange, orange, yellow-green, maybe even green, I need to make sure that I erase all of my labels that I already put on my page so that they don't show through the paint. Any pencil behind yellow will definitely show through the paint. You may not necessarily be able to see it, but I can see it when I'm up close. I can still see a Y right here and here and here because I didn't, I either pressed too hard with my graphite pencil and wasn't able to erase enough, or I didn't erase enough before I had paint down. Once you have paint down, you can't erase anymore. It won't work. So try and erase as well as possible. In these sections, I also lightened up my lines that went along here as well, so that when my yellow, orange, and my yellow meet together, they'll hopefully disguise that line. We don't want to do those in Sharpie, but we do want them to be nice and straight and close together. So again, I already painted one coat each of yellow, red, and orange. And in order for them to look even and opaque, I might need to do 2 or 3 coats of paint per section. So I already did one coat. I let that dry. I did it earlier today. And now I'm going to do another set of colors. You should only do one set of colors at a time. I've already figured out which colors wouldn't be touching, so that's why I started with yellow, red, and orange, because then I know that there's a section in between, so I'm not painting next to a wet color. So I wouldn't go yellow and then straight to yellow-orange, because the yellow would still be wet and I could mix them or smear them or cause a problem, all right? So I'm spacing in between. So when I do these, I want to choose one set of 3 colors. I've already listed out the different sets here. You'll eventually do all 4 sets. So I already did this one. Today I'm gonna work on this one on this video. I'm gonna have yellow-green, yellow-orange, and red-orange, which might look sort of red on the video, but it's definitely more orange than this red here. And then once I've got all those on, then I'll move on to this set and then this set. You can do this set and then this set, or this set and this set. Just, you want to do one set, let it dry, then move to the next set. So depending on how fast you paint, you can do this set and this set in a day, but you probably shouldn't be going that fast. For this section right here, in order for me to do both yellows and 1 or 2 reds, I believe it was this big red, that was about 30 minutes. And I was going slow so I could be really careful and stay in my lines without having to worry about anything. I'm going to go ahead and erase in the yellow-green section, because that's what I'm going to do first. And I'm only going to erase one section at a time. So I'm starting with my yellow-greens over here, which are going to be in my background. And I'm going to erase all my letters that indicate that this is yellow-green over here. Oh, and nope, I didn't. I thought that I missed that section. So I'm going to erase all my YGs over here. And I'm also going to lighten up this line right here so that my yellow-green doesn't mix with my graphite and we don't see where that green will go next, okay? So I'm just lightening it up. I'm not getting rid of it entirely. We're going to go right up to that line. That will help conceal it later. And I'm only doing one side at a time. So I am going to use my brush. Notice that in my paint palette I only have a little bit of each paint. I probably won't even need this much, which means I'm going to have to put it back into the bottle. You can always go back for more paint. It's harder to put it back. You only need a little paint on your brush at a time because we are painting on paper. It's not super thick, and in order to keep it nice and flat, I want to do a thin coat, let it dry, do another thin coat. So I'm going to start right here in the center, and I'm going to carefully start with each line. So I can see it. You may not be able to see it on the video. So I'm going to do each edge right up to its line and blend it out. I don't want to see where parts are thicker than others because that means that that paper will absorb more moisture and will start to buckle there. So I want to get it nice and even, carefully staying inside the lines I created. So artists aren't always supposed to stay inside the lines, but when we create our own lines, maybe we should, right? And in this project, we will be. So part of the project is being neat and clean. So I did that section. Now I'm going to move to this section. So I'm going to continue painting section by section with the colors that I have, with just enough paint on my brush to move smoothly across the paper. When I do the section over here where the yellow green is even smaller, I'll want to be more careful. Because I'm using a round brush, it has a very fine point, which means that I can get into the tiny detailed sections. I just need to be careful about how much pressure I apply to my brush, because the more pressure you apply, the wider it gets. And it's hard to see because my hand was in the way, but the more pressure we apply, the wider my brush gets. So I want to be careful about how much pressure I apply to my brush. You may decide that you need to turn your paper. I will probably be turning my paper so that I can easily get into my sections and stay neat and clean. Which is why we want to stay at our own table, and that way we have all the room we need to work. So I'm going to bend mine up here so that I don't have to move the camera, so I can get into this section here. Sometimes if you get up from your table just to talk to a friend or get an idea from somebody, that's fine, but you always need to go back to your table, because when you're away from your table, that's when things accidentally happen to your art, or something goes missing, or that note card you had that you can't find, that's where it disappears. Also, it creates a lot of noise and it makes it distracting for others to be working. Alright, so I'm going to just keep moving along. I will continue working my way around, and once this section's dry, then I can move on to my next set of colors. I will eventually do all 12 colors on the entire piece of art. Again, you probably will need to have multiple coats of some of the, specifically the lighter colors, but also probably the red and the orange that get a little darker. You can see brush strokes, and we want it to be nice and vivid, like we painted it with paint. So you might have to do more than one coat of paint. All right. When you switch between colors, you will want to use water to rinse out your brush, but you also need to dry it with paper towels. Okay, so you should be using a dry brush with only paint, not water on it, so you're getting the full vibrancy of the color. And I probably just got too much paint on my brush, so I'm actually going to come over here and share some. If you do that, you want to go back to it right away before it starts to dry, or you'll start to have a problem. It's actually better probably to put it back on your palette. So if you were working on this on your own and it wasn't a project where you had to have the color wheel in order with its complement like we're doing on this project, you could choose to do the interior of your letters or the exterior, you know, the foreground and the background. You could do the same sectioning like this, and you could swap back and forth between tints and shades. So you could still keep the color wheel theme, but then you would be able to not just have the full potency of colors. You could do tints and shades. You could mix them with their complements so they're more muted. You could scrap the entire color wheel thing, break it up into sections however you see fit, with shapes and or sectioning into different sections, and go with the tints all in one section and the shades in another section and go back and forth. You could do different amounts of tints and shades, so some are very light, some are very dark. There's lots of different possibilities. You don't have to do a graffiti name. You could make it just shapes. There's lots of ways that you could modify this project as a student or as a teacher to practice another skill. One of the skills that I like about this project is it's about staying in the lines, and it's about being tidy and neat. There's always other projects where we can work on that we don't have to always be tidy and neat. But this one is really creates a skill drill where you practice things that you might need to be able to do for some project in the future, without as much pressure on you for that. So when it starts to break up like this, then that means that my brush needs more paint. I'll probably show you this section and then the other section where I'm painting on the interior, and you would have the idea of how this works so the video doesn't go on forever. But you want to make sure that you smooth everything out, okay? It can be better to paint from a wet edge where you continue from the wet edge so that you don't have overlapping. Because this paint is so thin, it's not like thick as latex paint that you might put on the wall. It won't matter as much when you do that, because number one, we're going to go back and do another coat. Number two, it's really thin, so unless you have a big glob of paint like this where it's definitely thicker, you shouldn't have an issue with that. If you do have a glob of paint like this, you never want to just leave it until it starts to dry. You want to go ahead and feather it out with your brush so that you don't end up with thick paint that starts to buckle the paper. You can tell that my paper has started to buckle a little bit, but because it is so thin right now of a coat, that will settle down as it dries. And the reason for that is because when the fibers in the paper, the pulp fibers in the paper start to absorb water, they get thicker. And the moisture is only being applied from the front, so it has to have somewhere to go. If you apply moisture on both sides evenly, it will just get really wet, and then because it's paper, it'll probably fall apart. So that's why your paper starts to buckle when you are painting on paper. That's going to be a lot less noticeable if you're doing a canvas painting, or you've gessoed the canvas, or you're on wood or board, or you've sealed the surface of the paper. I obviously forgot to put my newsprint down, so now I have wet paint on my table that I want to get off before I move my paper back over that. I'm going to make sure that this section is nice and smooth and right to my line. And now I'll turn and I'll do this section over here. So I will probably do a sound off version of this as well without me talking, so we can speed it up. So I'm going to come in here again and I'm going to erase. There's a tiny, tiny wedge right in here of my yellow-green that I didn't label because on this side it is on the inside of my letter as well. This will be the only place where you get to see all the pieces of the color wheel come together in the middle and work together next to each other. So that is yellow-green to here. When I have enough paint on my brush, I can also make a really sharp point with my tip. You don't want to get too much paint, but you do need paint on there in order for you to continue with a really tight point and enable you to get paint right into the tiny spots that you need to get it into. You will have sharp corners and small little areas in almost any version of this unless you have planned way ahead and fiddled with your 12 sections so that you don't have tiny little sections in there that will need paint. In the end, we will go back over our Sharpie, so if you get a little paint on top of your Sharpie, that'll be fine. If you can keep it off, even better, because then that's less work for you later. However, it may take you more time to be that precise. Remember, when you press your brush too hard, it gets fatter, and it will paint outside of where you want because you're pressing too hard. So as my brush gets wider and more pressure, it gets wider in the area that I'm painting. I'm using I think this is a size 6 brush. Might be an 8. I have another size that's even bigger that I've been using on my color wheels. And you probably want to try and get a brush that's close to the size that you need. I tend to sometimes go bigger than I need to because for the large sections I want to have the ability to have the paint, but in the small sections, because I use a round brush, I can get into the tight corners. You can also use a flat brush. Some people prefer those for sharp edges and corners. You can try both. I definitely recommend trying it on a separate thing before you go straight to your project, just like we did our color wheels. That's so we have the practice of fitting into specific size spaces, staying in the lines, and knowing what colors are which and how to mix them, and practicing all of those skills to complete this project before we're actually on your fancy good paper or your final papers. Turn as you see fit to fit your brush in without having to do crazy hand things back in here, especially because then you can't see it maybe. You definitely want to make sure that you're careful with that kind of stuff. And I probably shouldn't have put that there because now I have to watch out that I don't get wet paint on my hand and then spread it somewhere else where I don't want it. If for some reason you do get paint in a section that you don't want, like I had accidentally already painted red purple and got it into my lime green section, in order to cover that over, I probably need to paint over it with white. before I go back over with the other color, especially if it's a much lighter color, so that they don't show through. And you can try, if you have like a big glob like this, you can try and get it off while it's wet, but you're still going to leave some there, right, that you would need to coat over with your white. So be careful and precise and go slow. That's also why we stay at our own desk, so somebody else doesn't show up visiting and bump our desk while we're trying to stay in these tight little lines. I know a lot of students think that I'm just being a mean old lady and saying, no, you can't hang out and visit and you need to stay at your table, but it's not just because I want you to be sad and lonely, which is not really what I want anyway. It's really important to make sure that your workspace is your workspace and other people aren't in it and affecting how your work goes. It's not just about them bumping the table, it's also about them distracting you so that you accidentally paint the wrong color in the section, and now you have to go and do more work to fix that. So I do realize that art can be social. I just always make sure that you are doing what you need for you to get the grade you want to get. So I've gotten both of my yellow-green sections completed. I can now move on to my yellow-orange or my red-orange. Before I do that, I need to wash out my brush. Agitate it so it touches the bottom so you get any paint that's still in your brush that's just trying to hold on out. And then you want to use your paper towel and really, really dry it before you move on to the next section. So my next section would be yellow-orange, which is right here. I'm going to do that on my own, and I will show you guys a little later the final project.